Hello, my name's Elliott Broughton. I am a principal here at DSC. I've got a pretty good background in the petrochemical refining, oil and gas industry. About 20 years of experience, various different things from projects to process safety to also doing sort of commercial planning for some very large operators. PSM is one of my strong suits, and we're looking forward to having great in-depth discussions that folks out there can get some benefit of what we talk about between us and our guests in these DSC PSM conversations.
Hi, my name's Frank Fatora. I work with DSE. I'm a chemical engineer by background. Approximately 40 years of experience in the industry, whether it's refining petrochemicals, natural gas, or chemical plants. A lot of experience in PSM. Today we're going to do a brief introduction to the PSM regulation and then start off into one of the more important parts, hazard analysis, and what kind of experience we can bring to bear on that. This is a first in a series by our company, and I just wanted to give a basic overview about PSM and one of the more important facets of it, PHA, hazards analysis. So with that, let's go a little bit over some of the historical perspective about process safety management. So PSM came into being in 1992 as a regulation by the government. OSHA enacted the PSM standard, it's 1910.119. And mainly this was in response to some requirements of the Clean Air Act, but it was also because there had been a number of significant process safety events where there were major explosions, fires, events. Some of the more obvious ones would have been Bhopal in 1980. I have to get that right, 1985, 84 maybe. I think it was 84. But there were other events such as Phillips Chemicals on the ship channel in 1989, Arco Chemical over in Channelview in 1990. Both events that had significant releases, fires, explosions, and a fair amount of loss of life. 17 in the event of Arco Chemical, I think 24 for Phillips. But after that, these regulations came into being and sort of highlighted that companies really needed to put in a whole management system to handle what it was called process safety, really risk management of how you operate with hazardous chemicals.
So, process hazard analysis is obviously a function that allows operators to help understand what the potential consequences are of specific causes that lead up to events like Bhopal, like you discussed, Frank.
Right.
And here at DSC, we perform process hazard evaluations. Specifically, we do what ifs and we do HAZOPs. So part of the discussion today is for us to kind of dive into what a PHA is, and specifically HAZOPs and what ifs, and help shed some light on the significance of really nailing down what a cause is, a specific cause, when you're doing a PHA, and then what is the actual consequence that is linked to that cause. And there could be multiple consequences that are a result of a particular cause. One of the sort of common mistakes a lot of PHA teams make is they think of causes in terms of multiple chains of events. And that's basically jeopardy is the way we rephrase that, right? You can get into double jeopardy, multiple jeopardy. And that type of approach just really is really opposite of what you want to do when you're trying to nail down a specific single cause. Because there's no way to really think about mitigation of that cause if you've got, an and scenario, right? You want to know a specific cause, you want to understand the specific consequence so that you can actually come up with a mitigation. And then and basically in the PHA or HAZOP terminology, we call that a safeguard, right? I will say software is a primary way that most HAZOP teams are conducting their PHAs in today's world. One of the products that we use here at DSC is PHA Pro. It's a very good tool. There are worksheets that are built into the software. We are a licensed user, and so we perform our HAZOPs that way. What I will say is you can perform a HAZOP with just a physical piece of paper that is in a worksheet template. So there are ways to capture HAZOPs outside of software programs, but personally, I would advise against that. I think it could become a little less efficient than using software. So that's a way to improve the overall efficiency of the way HAZOP is conducted. In terms of what ifs are a more flexible way of conducting a PHA. We've conducted hundreds of what ifs, and what ifs typically aren't as robust as the type of team you would have present in a what if process hazard evaluation. You'd actually have a facility person who is of knowledge of the operation of the asset. Maybe a second individual would be potential for maintenance, and then your facilitator for your what if. That is in contrast to a actual HAZOP. Okay, that HAZOP is going to have probably 5, maybe 6 people present at minimum, and you're going to have more capability in terms of technical capability, engineering resources, etc., that should be present in that HAZOP, so that you get a thorough vetting of moving through the different deviations, which we presented a list of what deviations are, as we were talking earlier. Again, those deviations are no flow, less flow, less temperature, more pressure, less pressure. All of those guide words help drive the dialogue around nailing down a specific cause and tying that to a specific consequence when you're doing a HAZOP. In terms of the what if, you're just brainstorming. So this smaller team, which it could be a big team, but typically it's a smaller group of folks, we are brainstorming, well, what if we have a pump that's in, let's call it cooling water service, which is feeding a heat exchanger, and it trips offline. Well, what if that happens? What's the consequence, right? So you're kind of capturing it in a similar way to HAZOP, but it's not as controlled through a set of deviations and guide words. What do you think about that, Frank, on terms of the contrast between a HAZOP and a what if?
What if is typically used for a smaller subset of issues, or maybe as a beginning HAZOP on an idea, but truly for a good hazard analysis, you would need to use a HAZOP and have the more deeper discussion of all the events and the initiating causes.
So what would be, like, when you think through what you've done in the past, what would be your breaking point? Like, how many pieces of equipment would you say you need to have as part of your PHA to springboard you from a what if to an actual HAZOP?
So if we were only doing a modification around a pump, depending upon what service it's in, I could see doing a what-if around that. But if we were replacing a complete reboiler circuit that included the pump, heat source going back into the tower, then that probably really needs a HAZOP. What ifs, you should generally have guidelines around that.
So with that said, there are requirements that OSHA mandates through the 1910 regulation, and that is that all new facilities that meet the quantity of hazardous material on site has to have an actual PHA to before you can commission the facility, right?
Correct.
Typical engineering firms like ours, when we help support what's called a greenfield build, we want to do the HAZOP early on because we don't want to get into a design that has a lot of flaws to it, that we do a lot of engineering and then we do our HAZOP too far along into it, that we end up having to do a lot of rework. So you want to do a HAZOP early on in your design process, and then as you're developing your design, you typically want to come back and then refresh your HAZOP before you finalize your complete set of plans for the new facility. Revalidation is something that we got to do every 5 years per OSHA's requirement. And this is another thing that we do here at DSC, so we got a very deep knowledge in that. But every 5 years, you need to assemble a PHA team to conduct a revalidation of the study that was done prior. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about revalidation.
And so you can do a revalidation, but there has to be specific requirements around that. I'm not going to say everybody, but a lot of companies do complete redos because there's gaps in the process safety information. If you have a well-developed system and you have all the information there, a revalidation, which is looking at the past HAZOP, making sure you've properly documented all changes, can be done. But there has to be a lot of structure to that. And a lot of times, people will find that they've had a lot of events and they just default to doing a complete redo. Now, whether that's needed or not, that's another story, but we'll talk about, we can help make those type of decisions.
Absolutely.
And work through that.
Absolutely. And what I will say, a redo isn't a bad thing, okay?
Not necessarily.
And at times, a redo, especially when you have a process that has changed quite a bit in the previous 5 years, so maybe you've added an additional tower, some sort of dehydration addition to a system, maybe you've added another train of heat exchangers, you've added some more storage to your process. All of these things can create a scenario where a redo is necessary. It's not saying that the previous HAZOP was done incorrectly or has a bunch of gaps or holes. It's just the fact that the process itself has changed such significance, a redo is warranted, right? And that's where you got to have trained people who are part of your facilitation team and part of the HAZOP team to discuss before you even commence to do your HAZOP as prep work, what makes sense. Should we be doing a redo, or can we really revalidate the previous work we did?
So we've been talking through HAZOP, but really in any hazard analysis, you have to have the right team. You have to decide on which methodology you're using and make sure it's appropriate for that situation. And then some things we haven't talked about is plans to address any risk or events that are identified. And then how do you communicate all these results out? Because just because you do the HAZOP doesn't mean it's finished.
That is correct.
You have to communicate that out to your workforce, what the results were. And so let's talk about the right team. You've talked a little bit about that, what if may be a little bit less stringent than the full HAZOP, but You definitely need a facilitator, somebody who's trained or who has done these type of hazard analysis, because you may think it's easy, but there's a structure you really need to go through, and you need some training on that. And then you need to have people familiar with the process, and depending upon your organization, what does that really mean? You need somebody from the operating group. You probably need somebody from maintenance, and in various organizations, does that mean the inspection department? Does it mean maintenance? Does it mean rotating equipment? Yes, it means all of that.
Right, absolutely.
Do they have to be there all the time? No. But you need to structure it that when they're there, you actually do address those issues. Inspection is a real critical one, because think of it, every time you do a turnaround, how many inspection findings do you have?
Yeah.
And you ought to be bringing those up during the HAZOP.
Absolutely. The other thing is incidents, right?
Incidents, yes, exactly.
So if you have a group of folks who don't understand the incident, but you have a person who isn't assigned to the HAZOP team, who is still at, working the facility or at the local unit
Site.
or site that the incident occurred, it's not a problem to invite them in to help express their knowledge of the incident, so that can be incorporated into the way the team is evaluating a particular node in the HAZOP.
Yeah, and companies do it different ways, We've seen it where you actually make a list of all the incidents over that 5-year period and go through it as one of the first nodes to go through. So this is really when you get all the way to the end and you've figured out the team is going to make recommendations. You're going to make recommendations, and that means something has to be done, whether that's an update to an operating procedure. Do we need to modify a piece of equipment? There could be any of a number of things, but they're going to have to be documented. They're going to have to be ranked or prioritized as to how long do you really need to take to do something like this.
That is absolutely right. And what I will say is the categorization of those particular actions or most cases called recommendations, right?
Right.
Is you're going to categorize it as either safety, environmental, operability, or just, an action that you want to have a particular person in the facility follow up on, right? So quantifying and risk ranking those is actually a core part of how you get to the final
HAZOP report.
HAZOP report.
And then after all that is done, you have to communicate the findings out to the organization, to the operating unit. Companies do that different ways, but per regulation, as long as you're operating the process, that HAZOP has to be available. All of the HAZOPs have to be available. But you have to think about how are you going to message that out to the organization. And then when you have findings, how are you going to track closure on those things?
Yes.
So you really have to be talking to management on some routine basis about, here are these findings, what's the status of them?
And that's a good point, Frank. So management also has to agree and approve those findings before the final report is, released and communicated out, right?
Correct.
So that's a core, I would say, standard of the OSHA 1910 regulation. The standard is that management will review and approve those findings, and then once those findings are agreed to, there has to be a plan of action to actually resolve those issues, right? And I think that's what you were touching on.
Yes.
It's like a process or some sort of vehicle that's a part of normal work process so that those actions can be resolved. So just to conclude this podcast, Frank, this has been a very insightful discussion. I enjoy sharing with you, and I'm sure you enjoy sharing with me.
Yeah.
We're going to continue to have podcasts, and at the end of each one, potentially we may be able to bring in some other guests as follow-up to our podcast, and then they get to be a part of the discussion to help grow and share the knowledge that we've gained over the many years that we've been in the industry.